recording these sessions, mostly so we can go back and listen to your thoughts again if we have questions or just want more clarification, but also as a resource for you or for others in the group who may not be able to make the meeting but want to get caught up. And then with that, we'll take a quick moment to do some introductions and just let everybody say hello and kind of get used to muting and unmuting. And we'll do this. I don't normally like to call people out in these meetings, but the easiest way to do it is for me to just recognize each of you, and you can tell us your name and your organization or your firm or however you want to introduce your affiliation. And then while that's happening, you'll see a question or two pop up on your screen that just asks you a bit about your experience with the cluster lot option that you can fill out as we're going. So as I said, I'm Sean Shepard. I'm with the planning department. And if we want to go to Anna, would you mind introducing yourself next?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Anna Brider, also with the planning department. I'm with the long range planning division. So some of you I've worked with and some of you I haven't, but I'm here to help Sean monitor the chat and raising of hands and just making sure that we're moving through and hearing from everyone. So thanks for joining in today. Hope we have lots of great discussion. And I'll pass it over to Catherine, also with planning.
Good morning, guys. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Catherine Herman. I'm a planner with Metro. I'm relatively new to Metro. I've been here about 5 months, but I know a lot of you from my time in Gallatin. Spent about 14 years in Gallatin, so this is a great new change for me. I'm excited to be here with you guys. I work on the land development team, so I work with the review planners. We would be reviewing cluster lot developments for compliance with the zoning regs. So, and then we would look at the subdivision regulations for plats after that. So looking forward to your feedback.
Thank you, Catherine. So we'll now go in the totally random order in which you guys appear in my video screen. So first I see Michael Garrigan.
Hey, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Michael Garrigan with Dillon Associates and here to learn.
Thanks, Michael. How about Bailey? You want to go next?
Sure. Bailey Neal with Legacy South Builders. I'm a builder developer.
Great. Thank you for being here. Chip.
Morning, everybody. Chip Howarth, Alfred Benish and Company. Engineer. Here to learn. Looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Before I lose it, there's a phone number in the chat that starts with 615 and ends with 02. I don't know who that is, but if you want to unmute yourself and speak next, that would be great.
Hey, Sean, this is Jeff Hines. I think that's me. I am trying to get in on the line, and it's loading very slowly. I don't know what's going on because I've been on WebEx before. But so I'm also dialed in. But Jeff Hines with Catalyst Design Group and planner landscape architect, and here to learn also.
Great. Thank you for being here. If you keep having trouble, unmute and let us know. I realize you can't raise your hand or chat if you haven't gotten WebEx yet, but we're not IT professionals, but we'll see what we can do. Okay,
appreciate it.
So how about Brett? Would you like to go next? All right, not hearing Brett. Brett, if you're trying to speak, you may need to press the mute button on WebEx before getting started. Okay, we might come back to him. I don't like to unmute people when they don't know it's coming in case they're taking another call. Okay, let's see. Jabal, would you like to go next?
Yeah, Jubal Paris, Gresham Smith, civil engineer surveyor.
Perfect, thank you. And then Sean.
Hey there, everybody. Good morning. Sean Henry, Tune and White Law Firm, land use attorney, zoning attorney. I don't know, whatever I can do. Glad to be here. Thanks for putting this together.
Thank you for joining us. So if anybody has a question for Sean, just make sure you designate which Sean. I think Sean Henry and I are accustomed to getting each other's emails on occasion by accident. So, okay, so we've had this little poll running, just some kind of easy warm-up questions. A few of you were able to find it. Some of you have not, but that's okay. I'm going to close it and share the results just so people can see what it looks like. But we heard everybody's affiliation, and it looks like of those who took the survey, a lot of you have advised clients or designed cluster subdivisions. So we're probably working with a decent knowledge base to get us started, which is great. So now we will move on into sort of the why we're here. So the Planning Commission has directed us to take a look at the existing cluster lot option and to kind of reach out to stakeholders and talk about whether there are any issues with the tool or ways we could consider improving it. And sort of one of the first things we've observed, maybe less so for this group, but in the course of public comment to the Commission on some recent cluster lot cases, it's pretty clear that we have a huge variety of sort of levels of understanding of this tool, what it is, what it could do. So part of our goal for these sessions is just some education. We may breeze through that a bit with this group so that we can spend your time and expertise on kind of the other parts. But with our other stakeholder groups, we're spending quite a bit of time just sort of explaining what it is and how it works. Secondly, the Commission would like us to take a look at or try to identify if there are any issues with the tool. So is it working well? Are there any gaps or issues with the standards? Is it yielding what we would expect it to yield? And your answer as sort of a land planning professional might be that it's working fine. But the Commission received a lot of comments that would suggest that it isn't quite doing what we might expect all the time, or maybe that we're not doing a good job of articulating the benefits. So that's part of what we want to talk through today. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about some ways that we could change or improve the standards and, you know, sort of what might get some traction with the Planning Commission on that front. I do want to kind of lay out up front that we don't have a preconceived direction for how this will go. We haven't drafted anything. So rather than putting something in front of you for you to react to, we're actually starting in the reverse and just kind of want to hear from different groups about what they know and how it's working. And if, you know, we get through that and it appears to have mostly been an education challenge, we may not make significant changes, or we may hear that there's some things that need to be addressed. But we'll sort of cross that bridge after we've gotten these initial rounds of feedback. So where we are in the process, we're in an evaluation phase. We've done a little bit of evaluation of kind of the past few years of cluster lot proposals, just trying to look for trends or themes about, you know, sort of what they're yielding. But primarily in this phase, we're talking to different stakeholder groups and getting their feedback. And then we'll take those ideas and go back and research them and try to draft them into something that might be workable as code. And then we'll come back to you and we'll say, did we get this right? Or do you have other suggestions? Refine that a bit. And all of that will happen before we move into any kind of adoption process. Once we do get into the sort of adoption phase, that will include full public comment with the, you know, general public, public hearings with the Planning Commission. And because these are zoning standards, if we do decide that they need to be tweaked, that will actually go all the way to Metro Council for approval. So kind of right at the beginning of a multi-step process. So here's who we're talking to. We're meeting with you guys today, sort of representatives of the development and land planning community. We're also meeting with a group of neighborhood leaders and residents. And then we've spoken with, we're calling them advocacy organizations, but sort of folks who have an interest in land development or sort of environmental or conservation kind of issues. and might be able to speak to some of those benefits of this kind of development pattern as we go through the process. And then obviously once we move into the adoption phase, we'll have everybody at the table. So these focused stakeholder groups, the general public, and then also the Planning Commission and Council. So how this is going to work today is we'll kind of have a section of information from staff where we'll throw some background or some information at you to kind of hopefully get ideas flowing or get questions coming to your mind that you want to ask. We'll try to keep that at a level where it's useful, but we don't want to bore you to death. And then we may ask another one of those poll questions if those are working for people. We may just do some kind of verbal question and answer. And then we'll have some time for open discussion where you can give feedback to staff or to each other. I know these virtual meetings can be a little funny, but you all have control over your own mute and your hand icon. So if you have a question, feel free to put that out at any time. We're here to listen to you primarily, rather than for you to listen to me talk. So if you have an idea, jump in and share it for sure. And then kind of before we move from one section to the next, we'll check in and kind of make sure everybody's still on board and ready to keep rolling. So with that, we'll have our first check-in. Does anybody have any questions on process or goals or about how to participate today? I'm also looking to see if we've had anybody else join us while I was going through that first section. I don't know if Anna, you've noticed. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Sorry. We've done WebEx with Brentwood. This is Brett Smith, planner, landscape architect, Reagan Smith. I can see and hear y'all, but can't use the computer or the office phone. So apologize for the delay there.
No worries. Thank you for being here. Okay. And is that, Brett, I don't want to call anybody's phone number out, but are you something 615 that ends in 75?
That's my cell phone, yes.
Okay, great. You may want to just keep that muted when you're not speaking and leave your WebEx login muted, and that'll get us covered.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Anybody else got questions or concerns?
I don't think anyone else new has joined, but I have just mentioned in the chat that feel free to post in there if when we're talking you have examples or links to things that you think we might be interested in, or if you're having technical difficulties or just want to share a thought but don't want to unmute at that time, feel free to use the chat as a tool as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Anna. All right, so with that, we'll sort of roll into the section that we're calling education or background. And based on, who's with us today, we're sort of operating on the assumption that you guys are familiar with the development process and have a pretty good sense fundamentally for how this works. So we'll show you kind of the way we're talking about these issues with the other stakeholders, but I'm not going to dive into things that I feel like you're probably already familiar with in too much detail. But, sort of as you know, development is a function of both the zoning code and the subdivision regulations. Zoning comes from council. It sets up your entitlements, including lot size and number of units. Subdivision gets approved by the Planning Commission and is just a process for division of land. But often you sort of need to utilize both sets of regulations and both processes to achieve the development that you're looking for, and particularly sometimes to utilize all of the entitlements that your zoning permits currently. So like in this example, we've got, if we pretend this green box is a 10,000 square foot piece of land zoned RS5 single family, in its current configuration under zoning, it gets one house. Obviously, if you were to go through the exercise of subdividing it into two 5,000 square foot lots, you've now got two houses, but that was all a function of the zoning that was already in place. So particularly for our conversation today, we're going to be talking about cluster, or some people call it conservation development. The sort of idea that you can group residential lots in a proposed subdivision closer together, often by reducing the lot size so that the rest of it is available for open space or recreation, or in some cases agriculture. And this is kind of an alternative set of zoning standards for lot size, open space, and transitions that you can utilize when you're designing a single family or 1 and 2 family subdivision. They already exist in the zoning code, so there's no rezoning involved here, which I'm sure you guys are aware of. So for purposes of today, we're talking about creation of new single family or 1 and 2 family lots, sort of the comparison between like a conventional subdivision layout that you might see on the left, where everything in the site goes into lots, versus a clustered or conservation subdivision like you see on the right, where those lots are smaller and grouped together, leaving more of the site in sort of common open space area. We've had to clarify for some of the other stakeholder groups, because I think the term cluster or clustered development or cluster lots has taken on some other connotations. So we're finding that some people, when they hear that term, they think of the concept from Nashville Next of clustering development in centers or along our corridors. Sometimes what comes to mind for folks are kind of cottage developments or HPRs, kind of where you have multiple units grouped on a site. For some people, it really conjures up anything that's multifamily or anything that feels more intense to them than what they're used to. So all of those are things that you could also potentially call clustered development, but they're not specifically what we're talking about today. We're really focused on this one tool that applies when you create new lots via subdivision. So why do it? Communities allow this kind of development for a bunch of different reasons. You know, commonly it's to create more area for open space, or to allow for site design that avoids hazardous areas. Maybe it's steep slopes or problem soils, greater protection for environmentally sensitive areas. Some communities kind of speak in their purpose and intent to saving costs on infrastructure. If you spread the lots out all the way to the back of the site, the roads go all the way through the site, eventually you dedicate those to Metro and they're maintaining them. If you are able to cluster the development in a smaller area, maybe you need less road. That's a cost saving for the developer, but it's also a cost saving for Metro long-term in terms of miles of road we're maintaining. And then some communities also focus very much on this as a way to create diverse housing types. Maybe folks don't want a big yard. Maybe a smaller lot yields a smaller house. Metro's current standards don't reference all of these right now. Specifically, our cluster lot option currently talks about flexibility of design, creation of common open space, and preservation of natural features or unique vegetation. And so I'm going to pause here for a second. Let me get another polling question open for you guys, because we're curious sort of what you would see as the most important one of those priorities or purposes to allow this in Nashville. So if you're in WebEx and you're able to see this poll, feel free to take it. If you're not, and you just want to chime in verbally on sort of which of those you think is most important, or if you think of a reason to allow this that we haven't included here, that's welcome as well. We'll give just a minute for that. All right. So lots of votes in. This is a pretty good spread, actually. I'll go ahead and close it and share. So we've got a couple for avoiding hazardous areas, a couple for protecting environmental features, and a couple for reducing infrastructure costs, which is not something our standards reference at this point. So that may be something that we want to talk about or start, incorporating as sort of a reason to do this kind of development. Okay. So, how does it work? I think most of you are probably generally familiar. You need a site that's zoned for single family or 1 and 2 family. We can pretend this is a stream and that these hatched lines are some sort of feature. Maybe it's a treed area, maybe it's a steep hillside. So in a conventional subdivision where the lots all have to be the size for your base zoning, maybe those features are incorporated into lots and they're critical lots. Whereas if a cluster subdivision is permitted, you're able to reduce the size, group them together, and leave those features undisturbed. That's one option, and that's what this example relies on. It's actually not required to be an environmental feature protection tool right now. So there just has to be 15% open space, but there's no specifications about what exactly goes in it. I think a lot of people use it this way, but this open space could very well be stormwater facilities or a playground or some other kind of open space. It doesn't necessarily have to protect environmental features under our current standards. So this chart gets a little overwhelming, but I think it's intended to sort of walk you through that in addition to sort of the basic concept of clustering. There are standards, for the size of the property that you need to qualify, as well as how much smaller you can make your lots. And in our current system, it's a reduction of the equivalent of 2 zoning districts. I will take a second because we tend to get this question a lot, where to sort of say that if you're zoned single family, you go 2 districts down in the single family list. Whereas if you're zoned 1 and 2 family, you go 2 districts down in the 1 and 2 family list. So for instance, if you're R10, you don't get to go to 5,000 square foot lots because there is no R5, there's an R6. And I think sometimes that gets confused, or we'll get asked for clarifications on that. So while we're here, I thought I'd mention it. There are standards for, sorry, I was seeing that a chat that Jeff did not have the opportunity to vote, but I'll keep going and I'll come back to that. So there are standards for, if you're going to have a duplex in the R districts, you can't reduce the lot size. There are standards for perimeter lots, some transition type of things that we'll come back to in more detail in a second. So let's see. I did also want to kind of briefly highlight for this group where this tool gets mentioned in our zoning code, because it is a zoning tool and it is an option. But it is referenced as an option that is encouraged in a few different places, and that would include the hillside development standards for 1 and 2 family lots. Same with floodplain, the cedar glade protection standards, which may not come into play that often, but it is there. Some form of clustering is allowed within planned unit developments, and I think a lot of the older clustered subdivisions that exist actually occurred through PUDs. Although the standards to cluster in a PUD are different than the standards for the cluster lot option outside of a PUD. In a PUD, you actually do have to put the environmental features into the sensitive areas into open space first. So they're a little more rigorous there. And then, it's similar to an approach that's taken in the rural subregs. which that PUD process is, where the sensitive areas are protected first, but you can utilize the cluster lot option as part of a rural character subdivision also. Interestingly, it doesn't come up in the conventional subdivision regulations. I guess like sort of logically that makes sense because once you've clustered, it's not conventional anymore. But there's no mention in Chapter 3 of the sort of tool other than when we're talking about compatibility in neighborhood maintenance areas. And there's just a note that if a cluster subdivision is proposed, the commission may consider an exception to the compatibility. So I'll stop there and we'll kind of catch up on the chat. Is everybody clear on information? Do you want to ask questions about what it is or how it works before we move on?
Hey, Sean, it's Sean Henry. Yeah, so curious to know what the problem is, what the issues have been here, because frankly, I'm just not aware that there's been a problem, but I think everybody on the call here would benefit. And maybe you're getting ready to do that, but that was my question. What has become the issue that the Planning Commission has been experiencing that's justifying all of this review?
Absolutely. So that is what I'm going to roll into next. Anybody else? Question, concern before I go?
Well, Sean, this is Jeff Hines. I put this in that chat I sent to you, but my perspective is the cluster lot option makes absolute sense, given that a lot of the on-market properties that are left out there have issues. They have slope issues, they have creeks running through them, whatever the case may be. So for those property owners to retain their value that is accrued in those sites without having to use the entirety of the property, I think the cluster lot option makes absolute sense given where we are in kind of our development process in Davidson County. So I'll just share that.
Sure. No, that's great. Thank you for chiming in. Okay.
This is Sean.
Yeah.
This is Brett. Can I?
Absolutely.
I want to echo what both Sean Henry and Jeff said. So to Jeff's point, what's left really needs a cluster provision. I've done several, and you know that we worked with y'all quite a bit on Goodall's up on Hunter's Lane. It was a T2 rural, and probably the biggest comment we have from Reagan Smith is there's a lot of challenges trying to make a T2 meet a cluster. There are some discrepancies between them. We can talk details offline, not take up the whole group, but there's quite a few provisions in the T2 rural ordinance that either contradict or make the cluster not work. Now, that said, the cluster, to Jeff's point, is critical. We need to be able to do it. Metro has their own stream buffers. We have more and more jurisdictional streams. We have slopes. Do want to say thanks. Now, I'm curious to Sean Henry's point, what's causing this. The other thing I'd say as a planner, and we talk about this in some of the planning conferences, is where do you put stuff like this? The cluster provisions in the zoning ordinance, the T2s in the subregs, the infill developments in Chapter 3 of the subregs, the walkable development subdivisions in Chapter 5 of the subregs. Are y'all looking at consolidating all these different subdivision types in one or the other? And I'll mute on that.
I think those are good questions. Let me put a couple of things out. We are not currently anticipating or trying to embark on an overhaul of the rural subdivision regulations. I think we are aware that, and I do think we want to hear as we go, if you see conflict points or sort of challenges like you mentioned, that's useful. I think there was a really extensive and pretty carefully compromised process getting to the rural subdivision regulations that we have now. And I think to the extent that we can try to address some of those concerns through the cluster, rather than reopening that subregs debate, we'd be glad to take a look at that. As far as why it's all scattered and could we consolidate it, I think it's a really good question. One of the things that's a little funky, I think the reason this lives in the zoning code is that there's it has to do with sort of lot size, which effectively has to do with density or use. And that's a power reserved for council. So we can't approve a subdivision that doesn't meet the minimum lot size unless there's something in the zoning code that says the minimum lot size is different, and under what standards. So it does feel like you've got to refer to 25 different things. And I hear you on that, but, and we'll certainly be looking at, ways that we can make it more clear how it all connects or stacks up. I think that's part of what we're exploring here, but I don't know what that's going to look like. We haven't gotten that far. Part of what we'll be doing is taking your feedback and trying to figure out, okay, is this kind of statement, whatever it is, best accomplished with a zoning standard or a subdivision standard? What do we need to be talking about amending to get at your feedback, whatever that is? So hopefully that kind of helps give folks a way to frame this analysis. I will kind of roll into the issues because I think this is a big question, sort of what we think it's fine, why are we here? So we went back and looked at the last 4 years or so of cluster lot subdivisions. I think what the Planning Commission is very much reacting to is what they hear from the public, what kind of comments and questions they get when these are proposed. And I think, as you guys probably know, like, public comment is not a perfect indicator of how things are working. Sometimes you get a ton of opposition and the tool is working exactly as we would expect and it's consistent with the zoning and folks are just uncomfortable with change. Sometimes you get no opposition, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we achieved whatever the goals are for a particular zoning tool. So, I think that that can go either way, but we did want to sort of report some of what the Planning Commission is hearing so that you guys, and I think some of you have probably heard this type of feedback or concern on projects that you've worked on from, neighboring property owners or et cetera. So the first is sort of, some comments that the open space is maybe left over, or it's not protecting the right things, or it's not usable to people who live in the neighborhood. The second kind of bucket of comments or questions or concerns has to do with neighborhood character a little bit, sort of that the clustered lots are different, or there's not enough transition, or they're too small relative to what's there. And then we get a lot of comments that would suggest that we don't really have the same understanding across the board between sort of the average citizen, planning staff, development professionals about what existing zoning permits. And that's a little bit of kind of an education issue, and we have some ideas about why that's confusing for people who don't do this kind of stuff for a living. And so we're going to talk a bit more about each of these kind of as we move forward. But I think what we have sort of begun to identify is that this tool is really trying to do a few different things at once. It's trying to recognize the existing zoning allowances that are out there, in some cases that have been in place since the 70s or the 90s. And it's trying to recognize that those, as I think Brett mentioned, are on sites that are more and more, or maybe Jeff, more and more sort of environmentally constrained in some way. And both that's a constraint to the owner or the developer of that property, but those features are also important to the public, right? They're part of what makes Nashville not a concrete jungle. So there are character building features. They help us manage stormwater. There's a lot of value in some of that. And then also neighborhood character. There are standards in there for transitions. Whether those are exactly right is part of what we're weighing in on through this process, but it's trying to do all of those three things. And I think what we're seeing is that in certain settings or on smaller sites, sometimes you can't do all of these at once, but because the tool is trying to, we get some kind of funky outcomes. And I think what it really boils down to, you know, to kind of illustrate it a little bit, is that, you know, we're used to, a lot of residents are used to seeing what we'll call conventional kind of subdivision patterns or land patterns that maybe we did in the 60s and 70s, where there wasn't a lot of attention to those sort of features. It was just kind of laid out. Whereas now, I think folks are trying to utilize the land more efficiently and in a more respectful way and sensitive way. And so we generally get proposals for patterns more like this, where we've avoided those sensitive features by making the lots smaller or putting them closer to the existing road. But don't get too fixated on the streams that start and stop in the middle of nowhere on this image. It's a cartoon, just roll with it. But basically, I think what we're seeing is that we have kind of a significant point of tension when you take patterns like what we see in the middle here and you drop them into an area that has a more conventional layout. Kind of residents on these kinds of streets, they interpret that clustered pattern as foreign. It's not a familiar development language for them. And I think that's kind of where we start to have folks showing up in vocal opposition. And we think, and as you know, I think you guys as development professionals would probably also feel that the middle version is better from a land planning perspective. It's, you know, more efficient use of the site for your client. It's protecting those sensitive areas. But the way it's currently structured, either folks don't understand it, which is an education problem, or the standards aren't calibrated quite right to kind of balance those competing goals of this tool in different settings. So as we kind of move forward through this discussion, I think that's, and kind of talk about some of the challenges, that's kind of what we want to get your input on, is sort of in different settings, do we have the standards balanced right with each other, right? The open space versus the zoning versus the transitions. How do we make sure that those are calibrated to achieve our goals in different parts of the county? We don't want to land spaceships in the middle of neighborhoods, but we don't want to forego some of the, you know, sort of better land planning principles where we can. So those are the issues, and I want to acknowledge that we see, or that we've heard, they're sort of driving this process. I think what we will do next is talk a little bit about how the standards could be tweaked to address some of these, or try to get your ideas for that. But before we do that, are there questions or other issues or challenges that you guys want to raise? You come at this from a different perspective, right? So we're getting the public feedback, but there may be things about this tool that are an issue in the sense that they just don't work well from a site design process. So sort of all of that is welcome, and you can raise it now, or we can sort of raise it as we go forward through the next section. But I'll pause here and see if anybody has any questions. Lots of hands going up, which is great. So I saw Brett's first.
Oh, yeah, I just unmuted. So a couple things. On that conventional subdivision, it was an early graphic and then one you had a while ago. Even if it's a conventional subdivision, you're never going to have one without open space now. There's going to be detention, stormwater quality. There's going to be open space now. And to Jeff's earlier point, there's probably going to be a stream or a metro stream or TDEC stream. So the chances of having a conventional without any open space and just lot to lot won't happen. And that's something we've had to say in planning commissions, not just in metro. But to your point, people expect to see the same thing they live in. What you have to explain is we can't do what you live in. We can't have as steep a streets. We can't have cul-de-sacs that small. We can't get into the stream that you live in. We can't develop the way their neighborhood. We got to have storm. And so that's going to be an education thing from staff more from the planning commission to these residents that come up and say, why does it not look like ours? I mean, you can't lay on the land the way they used to. So that's one thing. There's some other things I put in the chat on the street design and flexibility we can talk about in a minute. But back to that conventional, we're having this discussion in Nolanville, Thompson Station, Fairview, Franklin. People expect to see the same thing they live on. It doesn't matter what jurisdiction you are. There's state environmental regs. You can't do it anymore.
Great, thank you. I think that's useful, and hearing how you guys think about this or articulate it is helpful to us as we move through these conversations and think about the regulations. I saw Bailey's hand up next.
Yeah, thanks. I guess my question is, I think it's always a battle between developers and the community and, all the different interests, that basically boil down to more housing. It's and you guys are kind of, I would say, the referees of all of that. But my question is what is the top priority? Is affordability or actually providing new housing more important than having exactly perfect streetscapes? We've got probably 18% cost inflation year over year, and then the Stormwater Committee is about to release new stormwater regulations that's probably going to blow that number through the roof. So I think it's a matter of what is the ultimate priority, making everybody happy or giving them a house to live in? Thanks.
Yeah, no, and I would sort of turn that question on you guys too. If you're seeing maybe that works differently in different parts of the county in terms of what should be prioritized, but we'll welcome your ideas there. Chip, your hand was up.
Yeah, what I'm hearing, you say that y'all hear a ton of is neighbors saying, well, why don't these look like what we already have? And I mean, some of that is regulated by you guys. Like, for example, the landscape buffers that we need on a cluster lot, right? I mean, that is designed to separate it from what surrounds it, right? And there's just some things like that. Like, I mean, I can see where we get in the situation where people are like, well, that doesn't look like the rest of the street. It's like, well, and to others' points, like, because we had to do stormwater, we had to do some different things, but also because we've, in an effort to protect maybe the existing neighbors, we've done things that separate our cluster lots from the existing neighbors to the point where there's not a lot of flow. And so I think an evaluation of some of those type regulations and requirements maybe could solve some of that.
Great. Chip, do you want to run the rest of this meeting? Because that's where we're going. No, I think that's exactly why we wanted to have these conversations first, right? Like, we sometimes will perceive that there may be a challenge, but I think it's always helpful to hear where the people who are actually down in the dirt and designing these things, sort of what your perspective is on the standards and how they might actually be working counter to what we're trying to get to. I think, by virtue of the work that you do, you may see that more acutely than others. And that's actually kind of where we're headed with this conversation, is to touch on sort of each of those buckets of issues and say, there's 12 different things we could potentially do on this topic. Which of these would be meaningful and in what settings? And so I'm not seeing other hands up. I'm sure there's plenty going on in the chat that I may not be seeing carefully, but I'm going to keep rolling. But that doesn't mean that you can't bring up something. We haven't closed this topic. I think just kind of shifting into the next few slides will give us some more fodder for conversation. So we had sort of categorized this as discussion of potential solutions. And we went in, I'll say this, we're not trying to figure out today what the right number is or test this on a site. So you don't have to worry about that. We're also not asking you to say, this is a subdivision standard, you need to amend the subregs to do this versus the zoning to do that. You can give us your sort of general feedback and we'll plug it in backwards, right? We'll figure out where it needs to live. Don't worry too much about whether it's right. We'll do the feasibility testing. But we're going to kind of proceed through this loosely by those categories of issues, but we can absolutely skip around if folks would like. So since Chip brought up the character issues, maybe we'll start there and then we can come back to the open space question. So we hear a lot of too small, too different, they're too close together. Some of that is maybe a function, it's too abrupt along an existing street. Some of that, as Chip just alluded to, may be a function of the transition standards, so to speak, that we have in here now. So I think the other thing I want to point out on this issue, and we would be very curious to get your thoughts on, is one of the challenges to this tool is that it allows you to step down 2 districts from the base zoning. But in a lot of parts of Nashville, the existing pattern is still larger lots than the base zoning that applies to them, right? So what people have currently and what they're comparing to in their mind isn't necessarily even what their zoning permits. But it creates these kind of funny situations where you may have a property zoned RS10, you're permitted to cluster down to RS5, but if everything else on the street is actually still a half-acre lot, you've got 5,000 square foot lots immediately next door to half-acre lots, and maybe that is enough to be perceptible to people as kind of a sharp change. So I think the transition standards in here right now are pretty generic, but we would love to get your ideas in particular on how we sort of grapple with that situation where the clustering is happening when existing zoning hasn't, even been recognized or exercised around the clustered site. And it really is a much bigger kind of jump. So just to get some ideas flowing, I think in general, in the current standards, there's sort of, when is this applicable? And maybe it's talking about how much property you need to cluster to fit meaningfully with the neighborhood. Maybe you need a larger site. Maybe there's some context where we don't want to permit this, or maybe some that we want to specifically say it's appropriate. How much are we reducing the lot size? Should perimeter lots be different, or the first lots on a new block, or and then to Chip's point, sort of buffer yards or other kinds of standards. Do any of these jump out at you guys as a problem, as a good idea, sort of balancing kind of the comments you're hearing or what you're encountering when you design a site?
Let me jump in on one there. Sorry, I'm hearing that. That image you had of the two 1960s looking lot, and then the current one, we came up with this on the Hunter's Run T2 cluster. A lot of these houses were built in the county, years ago with septic. And so you have these large half-acre, 1-acre yards that were done before Metro went incorporated. So to your point, the zoning is now lesser, and we're jumping down 2 lots. So it looks a whole lot smaller, but the reason they have the big yards is because they were a septic neighborhood, just in the 60s, 70s, and recently the 80s, because sewer didn't extend to all these areas. So again, I said it a while ago, you can't even build what they live on now. But the streetscape, we can talk streets, but even if you just look at the infrastructure that's required, you have curb, you have gutter, you have sidewalks, you can't even match the ditch section now. And I mentioned the storm things, but there's just so many things. It's not just a land use, it's not just a lot size or a bulk standard. It's the infrastructure looks different. It's the road width looks different. The whole thing changes. And I was going to close with this. One of the things to keep in mind in Metro is each group has a set of criteria that in their totality does cause some challenges, is how I'll say it. You have fire marshal requirements, you have stormwater requirements, you have the planning requirements. Each group has a set of criteria that they look at, but when you add them all together, when you look at them in totality, it can be somewhat challenging. But we had this issue come up on that Hunter's Run deal, and you remember it was because they all had half-acre, three-quarter-acre lots from septic days. Now, if they're on sewer, there would be no reason to do that. And again, with road cost, I go back to, forgot who made the comment with the 18% each year. We're seeing road costs now in Nashville for a bulk graded lot, for a foundation, or for a slab on grade. We're seeing over $1,000 a linear foot. And that'll come into some infrastructure comments I'll have whenever it's appropriate. But I do want to point that out on those large lots and the roads. Thanks.
Yeah. I feel like Sean Henry was maybe also trying to jump in there, and then I'll circle back.
Yes, so, I think the minimum development site probably should increase. When you look at the example that's in the zoning code under section B of the cluster lot provision, it gives the example of an R10 zoning district. And so to do a cluster lot, it looks like all you need is 2.3 acres minimum site size. So if you have 2.3 acres, you can do a cluster lot subdivision of however many lots you can get in there. So that does seem to be extremely undersized, from a development size point. And I'll just make this comment while I got the floor, I guess. When this cluster lot provision was inserted into the zoning code back in 1998, it was after a significant discussion with not only the planning department and neighborhood groups, but the builder development community, so that there was a by right opportunity to do this on property that already, that's zoned for it, without having to go through the zoning process and getting a PUD overlay. And Sean Shepard, you touched on that history, because historically you had to do a PUD overlay on residential based on property in order to do any sort of reduced lot sizes, cluster lots, conservation subdivision. So the whole evolution here in our zoning code was, let's put a by right development option for conservation subdivisions that meets all these objectives. And so I'm just talking about procedure here. It's really critically important that as the formula gets modified through this process that you're going to go through, it's really important to maintain that by right conservation subdivision option for developers to be able to take a look at the zoning map and realize that they have an opportunity to go build some homes without an extraneous, and importantly, without a discretionary review being imposed on them as they go to the planning department and planning commission. And by the way, you all have the toughest job. I mean, I tell people all the time, the planners are dead center, right in the middle. You've got the crosshairs on you from the neighbors, from the council, from the developers. You're in the hot seat all the time, and it's a difficult job. But I also have seen here recently more deference being given by the planning department to neighborhood concerns, and the planning commission too, which seems to be becoming a little more political in character, listening to the loudest voices and then making decisions on whether or not a subdivision should be approved or not, because there's overwhelming concern about the cluster lots, for example. So the tough part, I think, really going forward is going to be education and selling the benefits of doing these cluster lot options. Thanks.
Hey, Sean.
Yeah. Yep.
This is Jeff. I do not have a hand option with my browser for whatever reason. Sorry.
That's okay.
But I thought with Sean offering that point, I'd jump in and just basically offer 3 points that came to mind here. One is, and I think probably the Planning Commission knows this, but for those on this call, I may be in this business the longest of anyone on the call we can see, but I go back to having come to Nashville in 1981, and I think one observation for both staff and Planning Commission is, with the social media options today, you're gonna have more naysayers on any project than you're ever gonna have. The information that's put out there by other members of the neighborhood taints exactly what the proposal is in many cases. it's easier access to that information, to bad information, and the people that would actually support a development, look at all our lives, are busy doing 10 million other things and are not going to invest the time to come out and say, we support this. So I think part of it is just a change in that we're going to have more negative feedback. It doesn't necessarily mean that the proposal is a bad one. Number two, I'd offer that when Rick Bernhardt came to Nashville, I think he did a wise thing in terms of the future revenue of the city. And that was, he looked at more intensive development where existing infrastructure was. And, with Nashville Next, there was an overall repolicing of what Nashville could be in neighborhoods, on streets where infrastructure existed. And it increased the density. And if we look at the coffers of Nashville, that's a very important thing as we go forward. So, cluster lot or anything that brings in a little bit more density or uses the full advantage of a piece of property, yes, it may look different, but there is a positive side to the city. And I think the Planning Commission needs to realize that in it's generating more tax-based revenue where there's existing infrastructure. You don't have to go maintain new infrastructure. That can be a positive for the long-term revenue stream of the city. And, I think you don't want to lose sight of that just from an overall planning policy. The third thing I'd offer is under your topic of solutions. The one thing, I think the ordinance works very well. The one thing where you have this case of very large lots that in honesty are probably close to reaching their lifespan, of what they may have been designed for. If we're talking residences that were built back in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, they're going to redevelop at some point. So to formulate policy around those neighbors that live on a larger lot, when that lot probably in the future, they will transition, the house will either require a major reinvestment of revenue versus just selling it. I don't know that that's good policy. The one thing I'd offer that I agree with Sean that the minimum lot size for doing this could be looked at. The other thing that could be looked at is how far in front of existing structures the new development could go. Similar to the streetscape average that we have when infill building occurs in Nashville. You can't get closer to the street than some of the existing. Well, I don't know that standard is appropriate, but perhaps you set something of, you can't be more than 20 or 30 feet in front of an existing residence, or there's a range. If that residence is 60-foot setback off the street, you can't be less than half, or if that residence is 200 feet, then that doesn't apply. But that might be one thing to help keep the streetscape a little more intact, where you don't have a house sitting out extremely far in front of its surrounding neighbors. So offer those things just for the group.
No, I think that's useful. I know there are a couple other hands up, but I want to interject a question here because I'm curious. You guys are giving us some actual standard suggestions, which is helpful. There are other sessions that are probably not going to get into this much detail. One of the things that the standards require now is that lots on the perimeter of your cluster development be 90% of the base zoning if they orient to an existing street, or then the amount you cluster has to do with that landscape buffer that Chip was referencing. And I think one of the things that we notice a little bit is that it's based on the size of the lot, but we've wondered whether that's actually a thing that's perceptible to people, right? Like, can you stand on the ground and tell the difference between you can to some extent, right? If there's more yard around a house, it looks bigger. But I was curious about this group's thoughts on whether it's actually the area of perimeter lots that we should be thinking about, or if it might be more about the the width or the landscape buffer should be different. I don't know what thoughts you guys have on that, or whether you experience that. Like, I don't know that the average person could look at a field in Iowa and say, this part of the field is 5,000 square feet versus 10. But I don't know that the area of perimeter lots is really the right way to address that. Maybe it is, but I would be curious. And if nobody knows, but you'd rather comment on something else, that's okay too. I know Bailey and Chip's hands have been up. Go ahead, Brett. I think that was Brett.
Yeah, but if somebody's hands up. So one of the things, we have a Nolensville thing tomorrow night. Same thing. It's a lot size. It's a paper exercise. To your point, Sean, it's a lot line on the ground. The client's probably not going to build a bigger house on a bigger lot. He's going to build the same thing he wants to build in there. It's just going to have more land area on the plat. And I think that's an important thing we're having to make in other places that are looking at this. It's a paper exercise and plan view, but your point's really good. When you're on the ground, do you see a difference in a 7,500 square foot lot or a 5,000 square foot? The client's going to build the same house on there, right? That's the market. They're not going to go up in house size just because a couple of these perimeter lots are on the edge of the property, have a few more square feet in the back or whatever.
Okay. Chip, your hand's been up. Do you have anything you want to share?
No, I mean, I don't know that I've got a ton to offer. I think you make, again, agreeing with Brett, I think you make a great point about, do you really notice, and Brett makes a good point about it being a paper exercise. I mean, do we really notice? Like, and what are the downstream effects of that? I mean, I get what we've been trying to do with landscape buffers and things, we've tried to make it so that, yes, this is a different entitlement than you, neighbor, so we're going to do some things to protect you. But I think Jeff made the point earlier, and I was thinking the same thing. I mean, you look all over the county, and you've got 2 acre lot in some places. People live on an acre and a half that have R20 or RS20 zoning. It's like, well, at some point that's going to change. And so reacting to those people in their current situation versus thinking of looking forward, I just don't think that's a good approach, and it'd be a missed opportunity.
Okay. Point taken. I'm keeping a bit of an eye on the clock. And so I want to kind of move us to the other categories, if I can, to get your thoughts on some of those. So I'm gonna back up a bit to our open space conundrum. I think one thing that's come up a few times in this meeting is sort of that the stormwater regulations are driving a fair amount of open space anyway, which I think is true. One of the sort of interesting kind of, maybe, I don't want to call it a disconnect, but maybe it is a disconnect. We sort of speak of this tool as being intended to protect sensitive environmental features. But then in some developments, I don't want to pick on anybody, this is allowed, this is a great neighborhood, I'm sure. The open space that we get is often comprised of those landscape buffer strips and a stormwater feature, right? And we know that there are public benefits to managing stormwater correctly. But if the code is sort of pitching this as a protecting features tool, then you might imagine how there are residents who are like, wait, you told me it was to protect something sensitive, and what I see is a strip of land and a stormwater bioretention area. Do you have ideas for how we might tweak the open space requirements or the purpose to try to get at that disconnect? It may just be that we're not all talking about it accurately. But that's sort of what we started.
Hey, Sean Shepherd, Sean Henry. That depiction, what we're hearing mostly from neighbors, of course, after this last week of rain, is control the stormwater, and it's an education process to say, we've had stormwater regulations for really since 1978. It's continued to evolve. You want stormwater protection. That plan of subdivision appears to do that. And it surprises me that some folks feel like, I mean, I'm not sure if they're asking that sometimes they do want to benefit from the open space. You know, the neighbors want to be able to come over onto the property that's being subdivided and walk through the open space that's being created. But, you know, it seems to me that those stormwater requirements that end up being open space is a public benefit that people may not fully appreciate. And the second point on that is you really can't do a conventional subdivision any longer because of the stormwater requirements. You can't do a conventional subdivision that does not have a homeowners association. The designers on this call can correct me, but my understanding is you cannot have a conventional subdivision today. There has to be open space because of the stormwater regulations. There has to be a homeowners association. And so the entire ownership character and subdivision character is different than we probably won't ever see a conventional subdivision in that respect.
Yeah, this is Brett. That's kind of what I led off with. Sean's right. And in that example, you know, developer doesn't want to put in a single loaded road at $1,000 a foot, right? That's adding all that cost on the ones across the street. Now, what you can do is make that storm area nice. You can put a trail, you can put a sitting area, you can put a wildflower meadow that takes periodic inundation. So you can make it a feature. And the fact that it's not behind lots but along the street kind of makes for a nice transition. It kind of speaks to the buffer and the transition from the existing lots to the proposed. So, but Sean's saying what I said early on, you're going to have a stormwater basin right there. That's the low part of the site, whatever size lots it is. And trying to connect the open space on that one's kind of difficult, and that's a smaller site. But Sean's right. You'll have an HOA no matter what. You'll have the same amount of stormwater infiltration, water quality that you're going to have based on infrastructure. 1 or 2 houses is going to make a difference. So make it a feature, make it on a single loaded road, almost make a park out of it. That's my thought on that one. It's not ours, obviously, but you're going to be seeing this, you know, open space and then streams and slopes, wetlands and metro stream buffers from now on.
Yeah, that was the thought that came to my mind, Sean. It's just that stormwater areas do not necessarily need to be unattractive. The cluster lot ordinance, as it's written, or section of the zoning code, it's probably more appropriate, refers to, you know, providing amenities, and it says they can be passive. If you wanted to do anything, maybe improve upon just the term when you say they can be passive recreation, or a certain percentage of the area has to include activities such as, you know, a trail or bench seating or whatever. You know, that might be, but stormwater areas in and of themselves should not be thrown out as they're not truly open space. I think there's great opportunity to develop those areas and perform multiple benefits in them.
That's useful. I see Brett and Chip with hands up. I don't know if those are relics or if you have other thoughts. Chip's went down. Okay.
Mine is just stuck in the raised position. I have no idea how to lower my hand at this point.
That's okay. If your arm gets tired, like in 3rd grade or something, just wave it frantically at the teacher. You know, we've had a few different mentions of the size of the site here, whether from the perspective of clustering or sort of what you can accomplish with the open space. And maybe this isn't a question that you guys can answer generically, but I've heard a few mentions that maybe the existing 10 times is too small. Do you have ideas for if it were a different threshold, what might be the right size of site to start with, like where it becomes workable for you to design in a way that meets all of these requirements? And you want to think about that and email me later, that's fine too. But that's come up a few times in a few different ways, and that could be something that we look at. Not that we want to, eliminate the option, but if there's a point at which nobody's doing it anyway, right, because it just isn't reasonable, then we could probably adjust that threshold, and the developments would, read a little better to the public, perhaps. So that's something to mull over.
I have some thoughts on that one, and Sean Henry had a good point. 2 acres is kind of small in Jolton. I think you can do a stepped approach. Right now, it's 2 lot sizes down with the largest buffer. Maybe what you do is a certain acreage parcel, native parcel, can go 1 lot size, and once you're over that, it can go 2 lot size, full 2 lot sizes. The other thing I would say is I'd base it on your CCM. What's appropriate in Jolton is not appropriate for downtown as far as a cluster lot goes. So rather than just having a one-size-fits-all for the county, I'd say you could do a stepped approach both in how many lot size you can step down and the CCM policy. I think that'll help guide you because, again, East Nashville's cluster is going to be a lot different than one in Jolton. That's my first take on it, rather than try to do one-size-fits-all.
I think that's a great suggestion. Bailey, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of second that. I think if you're, for instance, in the urban zoning overlay, it may be as a different set of regulations or just a different set of standards. We've got one that's about to be in process on Haywood Lane. If you look at the development pattern around Haywood Lane, it's all, I'm going to guess, 10,000 square foot lots, 7,500 square foot lots. But then the bulk of it right along Haywood is 7, 8, 10 acre deep lots with 200-foot wide ranch homes. And if you take this front setback as kind of the standard of your the new development, you're cutting off on a lot of these at least a fourth or a third of the buildable area when you push that development back off of Haywood Lane. And then the critical part of the lots are at the back. So you're taking 800 feet of developable, and now you're going down to 600 feet of developable if you look at kind of the existing pattern of front street setbacks.
Okay. That makes sense. So something to keep an eye out for on the kind of setback or in front of existing development question. I'm going to move us to this current zoning challenge because I'd like to walk this group through how we're trying to describe that when we're asked, and sort of get a sense for whether the way we're describing it actually jives with the way you think about a site and evaluate its potential. We hear a lot, like, I don't know how many lots this would permit. I don't understand it, or like, how aren't they getting more lots than zoning? And I think a lot of us in this meeting would probably say, well, no. But that concern or that question is coming from somewhere. So we've spent a little time trying to kind of figure out why. And the way we've sort of started trying to explain it is this. So if you have a site, right, the first way you can figure out how many lots that site can accommodate is just math. The acreage of the site divided by the minimum lot size, and you come up with some number. But I think we would all look at this and say, can I build this? No, right? The person who buys lot 5 can't get there from anywhere. So this is obviously not a site layout, right? It's just a mathematical maximum. And then what happens theoretically, and I'm going to use the term conventional just to mean something that isn't exercising the cluster lot option, right? It may or may not mean conventional septic layout or conventional no stormwater regulations, but just something that isn't utilizing cluster. That's a little bit of a, sort of mystery to people, right? You can't achieve more than math, but how close you can get to that is a function of the site-specific features and the site layout that someone develops. So it may also depend on the client. I don't know, maybe somebody wants to build a house for their kids on lots next door, and they're really only trying to get 3 lots out of it. Or maybe somebody builds a product that fits really well on that. I don't even know if that's is allowed. But just to kind of illustrate the point, or maybe you come up with something like this. And assuming for a moment that all three of those pictures met all of the different regulations that stack up and apply, we've already heard in this meeting that some of them may not, right? I don't know if you actually go through the motions of developing alternatives every time you design a site for someone, but you might in your head presumably go through a little bit of an exercise of where are the features, what do I have to accommodate? And there may be more than one solution to that that meets the standards. But I think planning doesn't see that exercise, right? Unless you choose to show it to us. The public definitely doesn't. And so this sort of what the conventional would yield, what would happen if it wasn't being clustered, is a little bit of a black box to them, right? They don't have a view into that part of the process. And so that, I think it creates this idea that like something shady is going on in there. I don't know. But, you know, I think in any case, we're very sure it's never more than what you get mathematically. But it may or may not, you know, look like what folks expect. So then when you get to the cluster, I think as you guys know, it already accounts for the likelihood that some infrastructure is going to be needed to serve the development. And the yield equation in the cluster lot standards actually required you to subtract 15% of the land area before you get started. So it's actually kind of already holding down the yield below, somewhere below mass, right? Right out of the gate. And we're going to talk that through with people. But I think there's kind of this, there is a thing I think that sometimes happens where, you know, folks will imagine that the most realistic thing in the conventional scenario is this or this or this or something else. Could this cluster lot ever be more lots than one of those? Sure, right? You may come up with a design where you can actually fit 9, where under meeting the conventional standards you couldn't. And so I think, you know, what we're trying to explain to the public is, you know, you're not getting more than zoning, right? It's not an increase in density. But the sort of point of this tool is that you may be able to more fully utilize the zoning. And that's okay, because we've decided, the royal we, the community, feel that trade-off is worth it. We're going to give the property owner more complete utilization of their existing entitlements because we think this development pattern, this open space, whatever it does, is preferable to any of these options from a public good standpoint. So, you know, I think some of this, like if we get the neighborhood transition standards calibrated correctly for the context, if we get how the open space is adjusted, calibrated correctly, you know, I think some of this sort of mystery box uneasiness may go away. But one of the things we were sort of toying with is if there's still concerns here. I mean, communities do this a bunch of different ways. We have a 15% assumption. I don't know if that aligns with what you find in reality or not. Some places require other areas to be subtracted out before calculating the yield. If that's already part of your design process, if you're already sort of factoring those things in just rationally, I know I can't really get to 10 because I know I've got to have stormwater somewhere. And we can illustrate that in the yield calculation, right? It's not a change in your process. It's just more accurately reflecting how you're designing anyway. That may help build some sort of better understanding or transparency around this issue. So I know we're getting really close to our wrap-up time, but I wanted to toss this out and kind of see what your thoughts are on that approach to explaining it and whether there are any adjustments we ought to make to help make it more transparent.
This is Brett. Sean Henry had a good point earlier, and that is we need to have some assurance at a planning commission stage what this cluster provision has. And it sounds like a lot of this is just convincing the neighbors who don't vote on this or convincing the planning commission that what we have as a design professional meets the regs. And of course, there's a lot of times where, to Sean Henry's point, we've worked with staff, y'all have a recommendation for approval, but the planning commission's listening to 101 people coming and opposing it. Now, in Brentwood, when we do an open space residential development, an OSRD, which is kind of y'all's version of a PUD or an SP, we have to show the current zoning yield. Let's say we have to do an R2, you get 26 lots, and then that OSRD can't have more than 26 lots. But that is a zoning matter. And to Sean Henry's point, we don't know that we're going to get that approved for 4, 5, 6 months. So the cluster provision as it stands right now does give some assurance. And I put in the thing here, we can demonstrate our site analysis. I know that the design professionals on here, we all go through the same thing. The slopes y'all have, the stream buffers, we get with engineers, see how much storm we need on the low parts of the site, and then we back into the layout. I've never, in quarter of a century here, ever gotten even close to 85% of the yield. The 15% is probably more close to conventional. It's just probably the roads. But to ask a question that Sean was asking earlier, is this somewhat to help educate the planning commission or to show the public the process? Where is this demonstration or the need to kind of explain the steps? Not that it's a secret, but where is this coming from here? And I'll close on that.
So I think we get a lot of questions about that, right? Or comments that it's sort of this is a rezoning without being one. And part of this process, right, we're asking you guys about adjustments to the standards. We're asking the other stakeholders about that as well. But in some cases, before people can make suggestions about whether a tool is working or not, they got to know what it is. And so part of that explanation I just went through was a bit of sort of the kind of explanation that we're giving people who don't do this for a living, to demonstrate that it's not a rezoning, but to demonstrate why, sort of one reason that this could be a valuable tool, right, is that, it balances, it tries to utilization of zoning that's already in place, zoning that is a right, with a better site design, or maybe at this point we should just be calling it a site design that's realistic given all the regulations we have in place. But I think the way that the purpose statement is written in the code right now, it conveys that this should somehow be perhaps more rigorous, right, than just meeting all of the basic stormwater standards. Now, that purpose statement has been the same since it got put in the zoning code before we had the current stormwater standards. So part of what I'm getting from this conversation today is that may be part of the issue here, right? Like at the time it was pitched as like, you're going to go above and beyond, and in exchange, we'll let you make the lot sizes smaller. But now we've sort of got a situation where just the base level has stepped up by the time you add up all the regulations. And so are we still describing this correctly, this process? I don't have an answer to that yet, but that's kind of like what's starting to bounce around in my mind based on the comments that you guys have had. Sean, I see your hand go up again.
Yes, ma'am. I think you nailed it on the head with that comment. And when you look at the current text of the zoning code, for example, the recreational facilities, as I read this yesterday, I thought, golly, this is really outdated. I mean, it's talking about building basketball courts and tennis courts and swimming pools and baseball diamonds. And, I don't know that anyone has built that in Davidson County as part of a subdivision. So I think you're right. When people see that recreational facilities are going to be mandated as part of a cluster lot subdivision, based on this text, they're expecting more than what's actually being provided. So clearly that text should be probably streamlined. And there was a question you had earlier regarding whether the recreation space or the open space should be passive or should, does the developer want to make it active? I think the market is really taking over that answer. What COVID has brought around here is that people are wanting, look who's working from home on this call. You know, I think everybody is pretty much at home here. So the market is looking for more opportunities to satisfy home buyers for more recreation opportunities in their immediate neighborhood. And that's going to happen. Clearly, this language, my only comment is this language certainly needs to be modernized. And I think this is a good time to do it.
Thank you for that, Sean. I don't want anyone to feel like they didn't get a chance to speak, but I do want to be really respectful of your time because we only ask you to hang with us through 11. So we kind of purposefully left this a little fluid, sort of what we would do next, because part of what's happening here is that we kind of need to see you guys, we're familiar with this tool and we're sort of able to jump directly into here's what is working for us, or here's what we see. Some of our other stakeholder groups are not. So they may actually need kind of more than one round before we're able to get meaningful feedback from them. But I think this was a lot of really helpful suggestions for us and sort of highlighting your perspective and giving us some stuff to chew on. Likely what we'll do, we'll hear from the other groups. And then we will, they may each get another session to try to help get them up to kind of a more general level of understanding. But then we may start to put together some options. I think there were a few suggestions today that are worth us exploring a little more. Maybe the standards are calibrated differently in different parts of the county. Maybe we start looking, as Sean said, at sort of modernizing some of the requirements to sort of how things work currently. And we'll play with that. And then we may send you kind of some written questions you can react to. We may eventually set up a session where we kind of bring from the different stakeholder groups together so that everyone can hear from each other. But we'll keep the timing on that a little fluid so we can make sure we have time to do our homework in between and make good use of your time. But if you have questions or ideas or additional things that come to you in the meantime, you're welcome to send me an email. I'm also happy to chat with you, but if you'll email me, that'll make it easier to set that up. And then we will, I'll send out these slides in case you want to reference them as you kind of give some more thought to these issues. There will be a recording, so I'll try to send that to this group as well in case you are really bored and want to listen to me talk more for a second time. And yeah, we'll reach back out maybe in the next week or so with sort of exactly what our next step will be and to get your availability for that. So with that, I'll wrap this up, but if you have any other questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out. We really appreciate you guys making time for this today. It's helpful for us as we go through this process.
Hey, this is Brett.
Sean.
I sent it in the chat. Oh, go ahead, Sean.
No, I was just saying thanks. So go ahead.
I was going to say thanks. It's great. It's great to have this kind of collaboration with professional staff in the consulting world and at the city. This is great. Thanks for listening to us.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you for being here.
Thanks, Sean. Sean.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.